There are some series that age far better after they've ended, but unfortunately Donny Cates' Thor isn't one of them, and today we're going to find out why. Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written primarily by Donny Cates and illustrated by Nic Klein, the first issue in this run of Thor was published by Marvel Comics in January of 2020, with the 35th and final issue being released in June of 2023, but from a different creative team. And Thor is now the King of Asgard. With new responsibilities and an age of peace across the 10 realms, life is somewhat boring for the Odin son. But when the Black Winter threatens his very existence, it will send him into the crosshairs of Thanos, the Hulk, and even Galactus. But what happens when his greatest weapon becomes his biggest obstacle? And what does being a king mean to someone who thrives as being a warrior? I can't think of a recent run that's had bigger shoes to fill than Donny Cates when he started on Thor. Before this, Jason Aaron had written the Odin son for nearly 8 years in one of the most critically acclaimed runs for both the character and also recent Marvel. And the thing that surprised me most is that Cates ran with that. Trust me, it's a rarity these days to not have the latest writer try to reverse or pretty much just pick and choose what had come before it. Or maybe it's just me being bitter about how Spencer kicked off his Spider-Man run. But I loved how Cates approached the ending of Aaron's run as just the beginning for his. Because King Thor is such a fascinating angle that I'm glad we got more time with, rather than it just being the closing chapter for Aaron's story. He is weathered and lacking motivation. The War of the Realms and the peace it ushered in is somewhat unfamiliar and underwhelming as a result. The title he'd been positioned towards since birth comes across as easier than anything that he's faced before, and being king just isn't what he thought it would be. And I was a huge fan of how Cates was facing this head on. Thor is such a storied character with so many prolific runs that I was curious how Cates could carve out his own legacy and not just fall into the shadow of those before him. That opening scene where he can't even be bothered to help the Avengers and just yeets Mjolnir across the realms. Yeah, it's funny at first and I can't fault his aim, but then I realised that the God of Thunder is missing his spark. So throwing Galactus into the mix halfway through the first issue was more than enough for me to fully buy into this storyline. What better way to counter the day-to-day struggles of being a king than having the World Eater crash onto Asgard? Just the way that Thor leapt into action as if he was finally being greeted with a worthy fight was hilarious and showed that the warrior was still in there. And trust me, it was a far more welcome sight than earlier when he was having to trade verbal jabs and bark orders at Loki, Sif and Volstagg. But all this is just me taking the long-winded way of saying that everything that the first issue did was exactly what was necessary to give this run the best start possible. Cates respected what had come before him, but also wasn't afraid of being himself and connected the plot to his previous titles like Silver Surfer Black and Cosmic Ghost Rider, whilst also immediately injecting a sense of mystery and dread with the threat of the Black Winter. It's not often that we get something that can scare Galactus, but for damn sure that would change if he was ever face to face with me, swear down. So the way that Cates framed the MacGuffin of this run was done to such a level that it didn't just feel like the next generic big bad thing that's more powerful and far worse than all the previous new big bad things that we get every few months. More so because it wasn't the threat it was primarily ushering in, but the new status quo for Thor becoming a herald. This is one of those concepts I could have sworn must have already been done. That's how cleanly Donny pulled this off. Add in that layer that Galactus rushed through this decision because of what the Black Winter showed him, and I knew this alliance couldn't last for long, but I was here for it. What's best with Thor books is that a lot of the aspects that can be grating for me in other titles are part of the experience here. Lengthy narration builds up to the mysticism and adds to the legacy of him being a god, and Cates finds a way to make the narration fun to read and add to the pacing, rather than be a massive hurdle or just words to fill out the page. Although I can't say the same for the final part of this run. He can just word it in a way that it sounds like an ethereal presence is gifting us with this knowledge, rather than it being a written description of what the art could just show us. Speaking of which, why isn't Nic Klein on more books? I think I recognise his name from some of Remender's Cap run, but this gave me a similar dreamlike feel as Ribbish, but less painted and more like the sketch quality I'd expect from Daniel Warren Johnson. Yeah, admittedly I do prefer the art styles of those two that I just mentioned because sometimes it could feel like pages weren't fully finished, especially in long shots or when there were a number of figures in the panel. Backgrounds could also be hit and miss when it comes to how much would be shown. When they were populated it would feel dense, but then on other pages it would be bare and like the same level of attention hadn't been shown. But you know what, it's a fair trade-off for those huge moments, the Galactus towering over a planet pages or the historic battles that Thor had been a part of, which were huge highlights of this run for me when it comes to the art. And although there are a few issues where other artists work on the book, his style was the one that defined the look of this run. And it's a look that I can't wait to see in an oversized format, which is why I'm glad that this is getting an omnibus later this year. And if you did want to pick that up or any other books, you can get them for a little bit less with the discount codes that we've got, with the channel sponsor for the EU we've got Comics Bugle, and for everybody else we've got Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. And Comics Bugle have been a huge support to this channel over the last year, so if you're in the EU and you want free shipping and free gifts with every order, then they are the only place that you need to go. And if you use code WOOFWOOF, you can get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale, so get your pre-orders in. I touched on another element before that Thor books managed to supersede for me, and it's that ability to incorporate history and lore without it feeling like the book is getting sidetracked. Cates has a finesse with this too, because a reference to the War of the Realms gets as much of a reaction from Thor as a battle that he spent 2 years fighting and can't remember who it was against anymore. Ironically, I think this did what Spencer was attempting to do with his Spider-Man run. It respected the history and continuity, but didn't derail the ongoing story just to prove that it knew the lore. Instead, it just touched on it as and when to build on what Cates was doing and the themes he was exploring, which is something I'll get into later. And yeah, it probably feels like I've talked about the first issue for a while now, but the fun didn't stop there. The uneasy alliance of Galactus and Thor kept me gripped, and every little disagreement between the two had me wondering if this would be the catalyst that led to the vision shown by the Black Winter. If anything, this was one of my only major problems with this opening story arc, because it should have been longer. I really could have gone for more issues of Thor and Galactus surveying planets for him to devour, because it was over far too quickly. There was just a great moral dilemma at the core of this story arc that really could have been explored further, especially because it was an interesting way to witness Thor as a king without having him just sit on his throne. The way in which he's willing to stand against Galactus to protect the inhabitants of a planet isn't just because he's an Avenger or the Odin son, but because he has that sense of responsibility to protect even more so now that he rules Asgard. Although, if exploring that further meant delaying the fight with Beta Ray Bill, then I'm happy with the way that things went. The fight itself was phenomenal and probably one of the best of the entire run, especially the standoff where they're both summoning Mjolnir, but more so because the new dynamic with Galactus is placing Thor in direct conflict with some of his greatest allies. But Cates presents it in a way that it's easy to recognise both sides of the argument. It's not just one of those contrived scenarios where two characters have to fight so that it can go on the front cover, although this run does do that exact same thing later on. But one thing those early issues made me realise is just how much Thor can be nerfed in other storylines. By having him go galactic from the beginning, he can unleash more of his power without a writer having to worry about it showing anyone else up. I can't lie, I did struggle a bit with the payoff to the Black Winter, and what originally felt like it was going to be a huge threat was more of an instrument of a prophecy to set up the rest of the run. Again, it was pretty much just a MacGuffin, and due to me having the benefit of hindsight now that I've finished the run, that now feels like a wasted opportunity. I was excited for this thing that could strike dread into Galactus, but in the end, it's a cloud demon that can create weird nightmare projections. Maybe this is me being my dumb reader self, but I'd rather go up against that than 90% of the other threats within the Marvel Universe. At least the framing of the reveal was fantastic and exemplified what I've said in other reviews, that the whole starting an issue after the event and flashing back works far better when it's not used in every issue. And yeah, I'm still looking at you, Killer Be Killed. Having it take place as a conversation between Thor and Surfer was great, and getting to see that fear on Thor as he sat on his throne was so unsettling, along with the fact that he couldn't even speak on what he saw. It's just a shame that what we got to see of Thanos wielding an Infinity Gem encrusted Mjolnir was too good of a tease, but I'll get to that later. Then there was a fun little 2-issue interlude that showed a lot of the heart that Cates could bring to this run. I don't have a lot to say about this one, but seeing Adam wield the power of Thor and he and the Odin son fly through the air was a nice tension break after everything to do with the Black Winter, even if it was a bit sudden when reading this in a binge. And I'm never going to say no to a Thor Iron Man scuffle, but I do wish this one would have been a bit longer, but I get why it wasn't because they're not enemies now, and there's a nice nod to the Straczynski run to remind us of that. And why I think these didn't just feel like filler issues is because it connects back to that theme of identity and struggling to understand who we are, or worse, that realization that we've lost part of ourselves. I'm saying this in retrospect because Thor's problems with Mjolnir only worsen as the run goes on, but Cates proved with these 2 issues that Thor can have a positive way of dealing with it, which was probably the ideal time considering that the next story arc, Prey, was the opposite of that. Now I love the concept of this, the way the premise unfolded at the beginning, and especially the final battle, but I have to admit it dragged a bit in the middle. It's kind of funny as well because this played on an idea that I'm guilty of forgetting that Donald Blake exists as an alter ego unless he's a part of the story that I'm reading. There's not too many heroes you can say that about, like you can't imagine doing this with Tony Stark or Peter Parker, so having a plot where Donald Blake seeks vengeance grabbed me from the word go. I touched on the theme of identity earlier, but this second arc took it to another level, exploring how the lack of one or lack of balance between the many identities we sometimes have to juggle can be our downfall. I thought he was going to say something about the importance of maintaining a secret identity, but it didn't go into it that much and instead went straight into Blake tearing through Asgard. I loved that scene of Thor travelling through the Elder Sleep and just plummeting into that chaos that Blake had left. At first I thought maybe Loki and Donald had planned this whole thing with the way he persuaded Thor to switch, but either way it was an interesting turn to see Thor held captive and experience the life he'd negligently subjected Blake to. It really gives you that you reap what you sow message. On top of that, it's just good to see Thor dealing with the ramifications of his own decisions and learning that a perfect life comes with its own problems. Whether he was aware of how long he'd left Blake or that he just thought it'd be fine because of the world that he'd left him in, this was Thor's doing, and emphasised that his actions carry even more weight now that he's king. It isn't just him fighting another god or someone his father's pissed off. This is a literal part of himself that he didn't see as important enough. But when it comes to the story, don't get me wrong, I get that Blake was also trying to catch up on what he'd missed out on, but just didn't care about stuff like him having dinner with Jane. It was sort of tense, sure, but after a few pages, I wanted this to be any other scene. I also feel there was a lot of time spent with Thor wallowing around in the Blake world and speaking with Jumungand? Did I get that one right? Thor books never make it easy with the names. If I'm trying to zero in on why there was that lull, I just think they made Blake too powerful from the get-go. Sure, they explained how he stole I'm just gonna say the dragon's power and combined it with the Odin Force, but he took out so many of the big hitters early on and Thor was being held captive, and I knew we'd just have to wait for that to resolve itself. Yet this arc did a good job of pulling everyone in without it feeling forced, with the exception of maybe Doctor Strange because he felt out of place, and I think the arc would have gone the exact same way without him, and he just seems to be that character lately that appears in everything that I'm reading. It's like how the Psycho Pirate is stalking my DC books. As well, was it just me or did part 5 of Prey feel like it was just a bank of splash pages? I ain't complaining though, because Nic Klein brought the same energy that he had for the Galactus arc and extended it to the rest of Asgard. Although I get being there to defend your realm and all that, but I'd be real annoyed if I bothered Doctor Strange's busy ass schedule to get portaled across to Asgard with all my fellow Asgardians, pulled Odin away from a good time boozing, to just stand around whilst Thor gets his moments. Don't get me wrong, it was fun for me as a reader, but if I was an Asgardian, I'd at least want to get a punch in on Blake. Like at least just one. You're telling me Thor couldn't just let them form an orderly queue and he'll get a good punch in? Yep, the Brit in me's coming out. I'm talking about queuing whilst in a battle. And look, I know I'm a dumb reader, but in the concluding issue, why is Odin apparently solely responsible for Blake turning insane? I get he created the alternate Earth for him to live in and the Odin Force was used to get him out, but he was leaving him there for that length of time that caused the problem in the first place. I checked and Thor and Loki acknowledged that they knew of the existence of that world before it had ever kicked off, so he can't claim he wasn't aware of the Nowhere world. I'm just saying Odin should have negotiated the blame he'd take for this. 70-30 sounds fair. As well, why would Thor trust Loki to not have some weird torture trap? Thor refused to kill Donald because he said he was like a brother, but then allowed him to suffer a much worse fate. Like, just look at this. He's getting poison dripped directly into his eyes. Maybe plausible deniability is strong with gods. But overall, despite some bumps in the middle and there being a lot of standing around during the final battle, Prey gave me the sense that Cates hadn't just scored a fluke with the opening issues and had a deep understanding of Thor and the direction he wanted to take him in. The pacing was great, which was essential considering that the theme of time kept cropping up. It's just a shame that time would become the biggest threat to what Donny Cates had planned with the Odin son. We open with Revelations, which ironically didn't reveal as much as the earlier arcs. But I can't lie, one strength that made this a very bingeable read early on was the way in which Cates made the arcs flow from one to the next. So getting to see the fallout of Prey and how morose Thor is whilst everyone around him celebrates gave weight to what had already happened. I liked how each subsequent story was slowly chipping away at him and he didn't just shrug off everything that was going on. Along with that is a continuing struggle that he's been having with Mjolnir, which is so connected to Thor's identity that without it you can see that his whole demeanor is different. The thought occupies his mind so much that he barely notices an invasion that's taking place on Earth, which admittedly I thought were those things that were in the first few issues of Invincible. It was fun to see Thor cross over a bit with the Avengers again, if not just to give further evidence to what I said earlier about just how powerful he really is in comparison to everyone else. I'm not blaming that on Cates, it's more so just how inconsistent Thor's power level can be over the years, and it helped to put into context just how big of a problem Thor's facing. But one thing I wasn't too big of a fan of was the voice that Cates used when introducing Cap. Yeah, it mellowed out a bit when he and Thor sat down to talk, but I just find it ironic considering I was speaking about the importance of identity, yet Steve spoke more like Stark or Peter Parker here. Oh, and remember earlier I said about adding a scene just so you can slap it on the front cover? Bam! Thor fighting Cap. I'm just glad this didn't lead to Civil War 3. I actually really like that the majority of this issue was just the two of them sitting and talking about the issues that Thor is facing, especially how it delved deeper into Thor's concept of time, which is one of the major themes of this run. Yet here it's more in the context of what time means for the people in his life, rather than for himself. Before he was king, when his life was chronicled from one battle to the next, entire lifetimes could pass in the blink of an eye. Whereas now that he's expected to fulfill his duties on the throne, he's faced with the realization that time shouldn't be taken for granted. Although none of us will live as long as Thor has, it is that bleak reminder that we'll all be confronted with at some point, that there are some things that we can't gain back. We can spend years in these feuds, or with problems that later mean nothing in the grand scheme, or assume that there'll always be a next time with certain people. And honestly, this makes me wonder if Cates was planning on killing Thor if this series had gone to its full conclusion. I wouldn't be surprised if that was in his original plan. Who knows? But if nothing else, I enjoyed the scenes we got where the idea of time is explored more, even if I'm not sure what it was trying to say in the grand scheme of things. The way he brings in Odin and other members of Thor's family so heavily from this point adds further fuel to my theory. But this also felt like the first major example of treading water in this run. Besides one reference, the series acts like this is the reintroduction to Odin, and not what we saw of him in Prey a few issues earlier. Like, yeah, it's not run breaking, but it feels odd. In fact, a lot of Revelation seems to only exist as a mini recap before the big storylines start again. Odin is still in the picture and Thor's still annoyed at him. I'm annoyed at Cates for reminding me that Phoenix is now technically Thor's mom, and check out my iceberg video if you don't know what I'm talking about. The Thanos vision is still involved and shouldn't be forgotten. Thor knows the Avengers and he's having issues with Mjolnir. Speaking of which, was the entire point of this story arc to distract us enough to be sort of surprised when Mjolnir is stolen from the Avengers vault, just to set up a Throg-led pet Avengers that seemingly went nowhere? Like honestly, was there a spin-off series that Marvel forgot to print alongside this? In saying that, there were still some enjoyable parts here, like the scene where Thor says nothing and manages to get Loki to talk himself into finding Mjolnir. Even that came with its hurdles. I may be in a very small minority here, but I am not a fan of the overly friendly brotherly Loki. I much prefer when you constantly feel like you can't trust him but know that you need to, where there is that constant sense that he's gonna double cross someone at a moment's notice, even his own brother, but there was just none of that here and I really missed that. Also, I really wasn't a fan of the art in the Masters of Whispers issue. There were two names listed, so I'm not sure who did what, but for some reason it just looked like it'd been entirely done on an iPad when they'd first been released and people were figuring out how to use them. On the surface, it might sound like I'm being overly critical on a fun few issues that find an interesting way to set up a Throg-led team of Avengers, but when I think back on the run as a whole, there were 4 issues spent here that could have been used to get Cates closer to the finish line he never got to take Thor across in the end. Again, time was the biggest villain of this run. If anything, God of Hammers felt like it would have been a more suitable closing arc, even if it would have felt a bit short, but still would have made more sense than what really happened. If I'm honest, the concept of Thor fighting the literal God of Hammers and the embodiment of Mjolnir reminded me a lot of what Cates had already done during his Venom run. Oh, Venom singers symbiotes. Okay, well let's have him fight Kull, the god of symbiotes. Thor singers lightning and Mjolnir. Okay, well let's have him fight Mjolnir in lightning form. Then throw in all the father-son elements and I couldn't help but draw up comparisons. Yeah, it might sound like I'm slating it, but the relationship between Thor and Odin really carried a lot of the great moments in God of Hammers, and really highlighted that idea that with time, we will eventually take on the responsibilities and possibly a similar identity to our parents. And the teachings they gave us will hold more weight the older that we get. When Thor is with his father, it's one of the few times in the book where he doesn't command the scene, where he isn't the guy everyone can turn to. He reverts back a bit to his younger self, and I really enjoyed those moments. Admittedly, I like the brief history of the hammer that kicked this off, which again is something that would normally feel like it's delaying the story, but here it helped give context to just how much has gone into it. The timing of that was particularly impressive, given how it took me by surprise that the dwarves of another place that I can't pronounce, had been killed as the first stop in Mjolnir's rampage. But having Thor and Odin start off in an almost buddy cop-like dynamic as they follow the trail was another idea that probably could have been explored further. Their bickering and butting heads, and having to work together to get information from Loki, all of that was great. If anything, it was a bit of a letdown when Mjolnir was fully revealed. Like, was I supposed to be able to guess that this is where it was going? After this, yeah, the battles were fun, but similar to what Cates had already done during Prey, just this time he switched out some of the Asgardians for Avengers members.
And Doctor Strange is here again, like, does this guy never get to take a nap?
It just read like another story where Thor is doubting himself, has tension with his dad, is attacked by someone who can wield some form of power that is, or the equivalent to Mjolnir, he's beaten, backup arrives, then Thor gets some kind of new power armor that helps him to win. And I've already seen a lot of Power Rangers episodes like that growing up. Now yeah, I really like the Thor Force armor, and I'd probably buy a Hot Toys of it if they made one.
Please don't though, I'm begging you, I have no money as it is.
But again, the whole someone having an experience with death during a battle with the main villain, which leads to the main hero gaining a new power to overcome said villain, with the exact same beats that Cates did during King in Black with Venom. I get that everyone has the cliches to rely on, like, how many times in this video have I said, I can't lie or I'll be honest? But I just thought Cates might have given it a few more years, or at least not made it so obvious. Perhaps in the way that I've already alluded to time being the biggest problem with this run. The longer it went on, it couldn't help but start to show those cracks, regardless of what would happen leading up to the end. But in a more deliberate sense, the death of Odin exemplifies that time eventually runs out for all of us. His sacrifice was poignant and meaningful, and had been set up well with the way his and Thor's relationship had developed. Again, I kinda wanted more time with these two together since there was so much animosity at the beginning, but maybe that was intentional from Cates. How often is it that when we lose someone close to us that we end up saying, I reckon I'd spent enough time with them? And it's quite comforting seeing that that feeling's even there for gods who live for thousands of years. Maybe the takeaway from Odin's death is to cherish the time that we do have, before the people we love are no longer here, or our priorities or responsibilities change, and that sometimes our periods of struggle are actually the most memorable in our lives. In the same way that the younger warrior Thor probably yearned for the days of being king and taking the mantle from Odin, but once it finally happened, he missed the days of battle and the lectures from his father. And I don't think I'm a million miles away from Cates' intention considering the story of God Country. That's only further punctuated by the scene following Odin's sacrifice being a flashback to when a young Thor was being taught how to use Mjolnir, especially considering that we were shown this whilst the peak of the battle was happening. It speaks to Cates' strength as a writer that this didn't feel like a waste of time when we should have been focused on the fight. It shows how Cates was committed to the core story he was telling, rather than just the ongoing one. The theme of the son becoming the father and the warrior becoming the king allows those types of flashbacks to have more meaning, and made me wonder what other times these two have had together that are now just lost to legend, that we can never experience again now that Odin's gone.
At least that's what I would think if they'd have just let Odin be dead.
Now I get that the gods and Valhalla exists, and this is a universe where people can even straight up come back from the dead, or return as visions, or exist within a different plane. But we didn't even get through the funeral issue before Odin started speaking through Mjolnir, which is a shame because this issue had a huge page count, but I couldn't care because I knew Odin wasn't really out of the picture. As well, this was an intense looking funeral. Pretty much everyone across the universe showed up, and it's just a really good job that there wasn't one villain that decided to hatch a plan that day, but the funeral didn't hit anywhere near as hard as it should have done because Odin's voice was still present throughout. Imagine how moving it could have been if they just held off on this reveal and had the funeral and the scene where Thor passes the arrow to Loki because he can't bring himself to fire it, and then after this is when Odin spoke through Mjolnir. I'm normally in the minority with a lot of my opinions, but I can't be the only one who rolled their eyes when Odin spoke the very issue after his death. The thing is though, once a crack shows, the dam will eventually break. And this is why I said earlier that God of Hammers may have been a more fitting conclusion for this run, because tonally the shift from Odin's funeral to Banner of War in the very next issue gave me such whiplash that I'm considering if I'm owed compensation. It did make me laugh early on though, and I mean really early, because there's a previously on page in the Alpha issue with a synopsis for both series, with Thor's pretty much just saying he's now king and Mjolnir's on the fritz, whereas Hulk's is like, he's actually 3 entities now, all of which have some different layer of connection to each other. He's also a spaceship, which powers some of the entities, but also feels the impact of others. He may also be part machine, and he also killed a bunch of people.
Like, was that supposed to be enough of an explanation for me to understand what's going on in that series?
Tonally though, this felt like a complete mismatch, which would have been more forgivable if Cates wasn't also writing the Hulk series. I can't give this a benefit of the doubt and say that the Thor issues might have just got pulled into this. Maybe this mini event reads better in the context of the Hulk series, and whilst I was reading it, I tried to separate it from the run as a whole, as there is a lot to enjoy here for what it is. this, but by god I couldn't ignore the poor timing of it. This came far too late in quite a serious run to go down the big dumb fun route. I did quite like Gamma Thor, and that Iron Man also had a bit of involvement with this. The art was also still nice and crisp and not a million miles away from what Klein had been doing, and I enjoyed the fights for as dumb as they were, but for whatever reason it just left a bad taste in my mouth, despite the fact that in concept I probably should have loved this. And yes, some of you may be tired of me connecting everything back to this, but it's time that was the problem once again. There's a dozen or so ways that this small Hulk crossover could have worked within the context of Thor's run, and maybe it would have been on a similar level to the Broxton issues earlier, yet because the timing was so off, and then what would follow was a victim of circumstance, Banner of War was the closest thing we really got to Donny Cates ending his run.
And maybe, as much as it pains me to say it, it would have been for the best if it had ended here.
Venom of Asgard. That's the title of the first arc to kick off the slow transition of Cates leaving Thor. He was still being credited as plot in the book, alongside Al Ewing who comes on as scripter, and I can only read between the lines from the few tweets and articles I've seen about Donny's slow departure from both this and Hulk, and it does unfortunately seem like life just got on top of him. Regardless of how I feel about this or any of his books, I hope the guy is okay and that he overcomes his struggles, but in the same way that I judge Tom King's Batman for the book that was in front of me, rather than the editorial issues that it had, I have to do the same thing with Thor, and unfortunately, the final stretch of issues in this run took me longer to read than the first 26. I know Al Ewing is pretty much one of those creators that you can't say a bad thing about because the first 15 issues of the Immortal Hulk were great, which as I found out means that the entire 50 issue run is immune to criticism, but there's just something about his writing that felt like a mismatch with Cates. The narration was no longer adding to what was on the page, and instead does the thing that I praised the earlier arcs for not doing,
and just told us what we already knew.
Maybe Ewing thought that people would jump on this from his Venom run that was happening at the time, but that's what the previously page is for. So yeah, Venom's in this because I think I said his name too many times earlier, and this could have had a self-rage charm to it because these characters are figuratively and literally worlds apart. But it just felt obvious that this was because Ewing was writing Venom at that point and Cates had done previously. So if Banner of War felt forced, then this crossover felt like it was meant to be in a different series altogether. Worse so, it didn't even feel like Eddie was recognisable in this storyline. I get he's the King in Black now and gone on some kind of otherworldly journey, but something just wasn't clicking for me. Who knows, maybe it's best that I check out the Ewing Venom run. And yeah, everybody probably figured it out way before I did, but this was the arc where it really sank in that the solution to every storyline was just going to be a different armor or power up. Again, similar to Herald Thor, Destroyer Thor, Thor Force Thor, and Gamma Thor, quite difficult to say a lot of those when you've got a bit of a lisp. Symbiote Thor was a lot of fun and a cool design, but the spectacle of the Odin Son having a new look had really overstayed its welcome by this point. Dark Arthur, villain so forgettable that I had to double check his name, had a Mjolnir-like weapon that could match its power, and it felt like a light version of all the story arcs that I'd read so far. As well, this just made me realise that Salvador Larroca is the most hit or miss artist for me. I liked his mechs in Invincible Iron Man and the work that he did on Vader, but here the faces looked overly airbrushed and that they aren't actually on the body, and eyes would look like they were from two different faces. Fortunately he was only a guest artist on this, but Nic Klein's return couldn't even disguise how drastic things changed once Donny Cates left between issues. There was what felt like a last-ditch attempt to try and end this the way that Cates wanted to with a Death Note setup, but if I wasn't already disappointed because Ryuk didn't haunt Thanos, then I really was once I realised that the vision that we've been working towards through the Black Winter wouldn't be coming to fruition. In an era where most runs seem to end with a big crossover event, I don't think I know enough words in either English or Asgardian to convey how disappointed I was. This was the stage when Grunbeck took over,
a writer whose name sounds like it should be a character in a Thor book.
And honestly, it felt like she hadn't read any of the Cates issues, but knew there was something promised with Thanos and nothing else. The thing is, and I've learned this the hard way, when you try to make something smarter than it is, it will just fall flat on its face. And in the biggest middle finger to my theory on the theme of time, it's time travel that makes this run a complete mess. I don't really understand why it had to go down this route and why Grunbeck thought this was the best way to give a satisfying story, or more so why it didn't at least try to fulfill the vision Cates had set up with the Infinity Hammer. It could have gone down this road of telling a story that was like, yeah, Thanos might be at his most powerful and have an army of heroes that are now zombies, and he's also got the Infinity Hammer and a Dark Gauntlet, but Thor alone is enough to overcome that, and he doesn't need a new armor, and he knows what his identity is. It's probably a combination of poor writing and me just checking out of the series, but I didn't even notice when Legacy of Thanos had ended. What was the point of this story arc?
Actually, don't answer that, I don't care anyway.
The timelines all play out concurrently, and if you dare to stop caring for even a few pages, there's a good chance she'll either be in the past with Thor's grandfather Bor, which is an accurate way of describing this ending, in the future with Thor's now grown-up baby sister Lorsa, or in the present day but a few hours before or after no specific time with Doctor Doom. But in the majority of these scenarios, you won't be with Thor. I get that they used Odin's inability to move on to Valhalla as a springboard to investigate why that's the case, and where the missing souls went, but this wasn't the parts of Cates' run that I felt desperately needed a conclusion. The funniest part was that the final two covers seemed to get the memo that the opening vision hadn't been delivered on, so they slapped Thanos on one and the Dark Gauntlet on the other.
Because that's the same as Thanos leading an army of zombies against Thor.
As well, the art style shifted drastically once Nic Klein left, and all I could think of was the shitty way that they got rid of Poochie in The Simpsons, because by comparison, the style was so basic. Honestly, yeah, I get that that might seem mean to say, but it was just so jarring compared to the tone of the earlier issues. There were aspects here that reminded me loosely of Mike Allred or Joel Jones, but that wasn't the look this Thor series had gone for. Like, I reckon we've all got our own hints that signify if we're not enjoying a title, and for me, it's if I have to read the previously on. If it's a crossover, then yeah, naturally I'd kinda glance at it, but for these last 5 or so issues, I had to read every single one because it just wasn't enjoyable, and I kept forgetting why Doctor Doom was suddenly in this. It's ironic as well, considering how I praised Galactus' appearance at the beginning, yet I'm saying that this is out of left field, but maybe my dumb reader self didn't notice any signs, but there were zero clues for me that he was going to get involved in the mix. And as much as I love Doctor Doom, I couldn't help but feel that this story was told instead of the one that we were promised with Thanos. Like, are you telling me that if Cates was still 100% in on this, he'd have gone for a time travel story where Thanos is looking for a stone that ends up being some kind of womb with a child in it? Am I really supposed to believe that's where the vision would take us? So in the end, we got a wish version of what was prophesized, and it casts an unfortunate shadow on the overall run. In another stroke of irony, the very identity of this series was lost by the end. Thor became a background character in a series that initially tried to explore who Thor is if you take him away from what he knows. So we're left with a title that was full of promises, but delivered on few. I wish I could look back on this title more fondly, and even now I could probably read those earlier story arcs and enjoy them, but it'll always come with a massive what if. Comics is full of great ones from over the years, but I wonder for a while what this series could have been if Kate had seen it through. Sure, circumstances change and life happens, and those cracks that I noticed during God of Hammers and Banner of War could have been a sign of the direction it was going in, but I'd prefer to think that those arcs were affected by whatever it was that eventually led Kate to leave. But the real reason why I had such high hopes for returning to this run was because it was the last series that I read in single issues. And then something happened in March of 2020 that meant that I couldn't go to the comic shop for a while, and because of that, I never came back to this run until now. There were stories I'd hear about how the series was going and arcs that were coming up, and I remained hopeful that I could dive back in with the same excitement that I left it with. But slowly, month by month, that hope dwindled. Time was both a central component on Cates' run on Thor, but also the thing that ultimately led to its downfall. Donny believed he would have enough time to bring this across the finish line in the way that he intended to from the beginning, which allowed him to have more story arcs and a few sweet filler issues, and even explore the concept of time in relation to someone who has more than most.
But as the issues turned into arcs and the months turned into years, time got the better of this run, and I can't help but realise that the majority of the problems that I had with the ending of this Thor run in some way was a result of or the victim of time, and unfortunately for me, that became the identity that I associate with this book. This is my final verdict. And sometimes it's easier to learn from the runs that could have been great than it is from the ones that are. Donny Cates' run on Thor is a prime example of that, because there's no telling the heights it could have reached if it hadn't have been unfortunately ended so suddenly. There was promise from the very first issue that this take on the Odin Son could possibly stand with the very best, blending the greatest elements of Asgard with those that Cates had already experimented with during his time at Marvel. But if there's one thing that we can learn from this, it's that nothing is guaranteed, and that sometimes it's better to finish your story and maybe miss out on some of the beats along the way, rather than have to watch someone come in and pick up the pieces but end up with the wrong picture. If I'm looking at this from a percentage standpoint, then I had a great time with this run. The Devourer King, Prey and God of Hammers did at least enough to be able to stand in the same room as other great Thor stories, even if they wouldn't be allowed to sit at the table. But just like the Black Winter, the concluding third of this series casts a dark cloud over all the good that was done before. Even some of the later arcs done by Cates before Grunbeck had taken over, like Banner of War, throw doubt onto just how good good this title could have been. But regardless, I would still recommend this run, if nothing else as just a fascinating case study for how quickly the tide can change. And even with knowing that it's going to leave a sour taste in your mouth by the end, it still has fantastic art from Nic Klein and proposes some interesting questions about time and identity. It's far from the best Thor run that's ever existed, but maybe to its benefit, there will always be an asterisk next to it. And the what if that it proposes is almost worth the cost of admission alone. But if I had to sum up Thor by Donny Cates in one sentence, it will lead you with more questions than answers, but the journey to those questions is still worthy. But fair warning, it will drop off hard.